Afternoon. Are you having a great time? Are you learning something? Do you know that your collaboration makes the difference? That was too weak. Yes! Last night we heard the children speak, and they gave us an important lesson, and that is to listen to them, defend them in the violence. So, as one of the co-chairs of Defending Children, I am honored to be here today. And speaking of the children, I'm reminded of something that, talking about evidence-based practices. When Dr. Saunders was talking this morning, I thought, well, I'm going to mention this in my opening remarks this afternoon. About 10 years ago, I was head of Children and Family Services, and I wanted to go out to the agencies to learn how do they prove that what they're doing is meaningful. And I went to one of the more respected agencies, and after a number of questions, I asked them this question, and one of the senior counselors says, well, I need to tell you a story. The story goes that two young teenage boys were out to lunch one afternoon, and they came back and talked to their counselor, and they were very excited. And she says, well, what are you so excited about? He says, well, we were just at a restaurant, McDonald's as it turns out, and two men were there and they were arguing. And they started to fight. And the counselor says, well, why is that important to you? They both said, they need our anger management training. That's what this is about, is having the children telling us what works. And this conference is built on that foundation, the foundation that we as a collaborative group, coming from the total diversity that we all represent, can and do make a difference. We are really honored to have with us Charles Wilson. And this is an individual that has an extraordinary background. So, who is Charles Wilson? He started out as a dedicated social worker that wanted to make a difference and protect children. And as I read you his resume, he hasn't changed a bit. He has just taken that view from his heart and made it into an extraordinary profession. He previously served in a variety of child protection roles, starting off in the frontline social worker in the 70s in Tennessee and Florida. He served as the state child welfare director in Tennessee for 13 years from 1982 to 1995. He's a former executive director of the National Children's Advocacy Center in Huntsville, Alabama. He's past president of the American Professional Society of Abuse of Children. Former executive officer member of the National Children's Alliance Board of Directors, past vice president of the National Association of Public Child Welfare Administrators. Those are some of the things he's done. Today, he is the executive director of the Chadwick Center for Children and Families and serves in the Sam and Rose Stein Endowment Chair in Child Protection at the Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego, where he oversees a large multi-service child and family maltreatment services along with professional education and research. Mr. Wilson also serves as the director of the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare via the contract with the California Department of Social Services. And he is co-chairs the Child Welfare Committee of the SAMHSA-funded National Child Traumatic Stress Network and chairs the San Diego County Child Protection Team Management Committee. This is a very busy man. Mr. Wilson has authored articles, chapters, and books. One that I want to mention that he has done with his wife, who has a police background, entitled Team Investigation of Child Sexual Abuse. He is a frequent speaker to national and international conferences. He is here today. Let's welcome Charles Wilson.
Not sure I can live up to that introduction. But as you heard, I have been floating around this field a long time. And is this volume okay? Can you hear me in the back? Actually, I can trace my origins in this field. We were talking over lunch. I mean, what got me into this field? I actually know the minute. I have the advantage of thinking back and remembering the exact moment I decided I'm going to spend my career working with abuse and neglect and the kids and families that are impacted by it. It was in the early 1970s. I was going to be a teacher because I wanted to do something relevant, and then, teachers were doing relevant work. We all wanted to be relevant in the 1960s and 70s. And I was working in an inner city junior high school in Miami, where I was going to college. Came home one day, and there was a TV commercial on. And, no one in the 1960s and early 70s talked about child abuse. Child abuse wasn't on the front page. It wasn't something that was commonly discussed. If you didn't go looking for conversations and it wasn't happening in your family, you were completely unaware that this thing was going on in society. And this actually turned out to be a rather famous landmark public service announcement came on from the state of Florida. And all it had was these babies crawling towards the camera. And nursery rhyme music playing in the background. This is kind of soft background. And here I am, this long-haired, kind of hippie-ish student teacher. And these babies crawling there, and I just pause as I'm walking through the room and stop. And, just like when I see a baby in a grocery store today in a cart, kind of looks at me, or the airport coming here. I kind of still kind of wave to little kids and see if I can engage them a little bit. So I like little kids, and these kids are calling to work. It made me feel good. And then a male voice came on and only said a few words. Who would hurt a little child? And then they rolled the statistics. And there was something about the juxtaposition of this idealized image of childhood with the harsh realities. It turns out, we learned 30, 40 years later, it was much worse than we thought in 1972. But the harsh realities of what had happened to Florida's kids in the year before. We decided I wanted to go do something about it. We went off to find a job as a child welfare worker, and found it in Wauchula, Florida, which, among other things, is the cucumber capital of the world. It's kind of weird. They have cucumbers on the side of the police cars. But that job introduced me to a whole set of sights and sounds, experiences I had never dealt with. Growing up in a home that, quite frankly, looked a lot like the Cleaver household. I mean, I was the lucky one. I didn't experience abuse. I didn't know it existed. But there was something unfair about big people hurting little people that I decided this is what I want to do for a living. And I thought if I cared enough that I could really make a difference. And I went off with these fantasies of kind of this rushing in and rescuing kids, and quickly found it was much more complicated than that. And within a year or so, realized I don't know what I'm doing. This manual's not telling me what I'm doing. Training back then was go in the room, read the policy manual, read some case records, and a week or so later, they open the door and tell you to come out and they'll go see your first client. And so I was completely ill-equipped for what I was doing. So I thought, well, if I go to graduate school, I'd find out what's really going on. I'd understand how to do this job. Indeed, I went to graduate school in Tennessee, ended up working for the Tennessee system, and coming out equipped with all the information. I literally read everything in 1977 written in the English language about child abuse. And I could do that in 1977 because there really wasn't that much written. We've had an information explosion. But I went out thinking, armed with this knowledge, I could really make a difference. And I remember now that summer in 1977 and walking up to a household. It was one of these, you may have them in Cleveland too. In Memphis, we call them shotgun houses, long, narrow wooden houses that were about 3 times longer than they were wide. Hot summer day, and there were 2 patrol officers on the front desk, or the front steps of this place. And I said, I'm with Child Protective Services. We got a report a child had been sexually abused. And in 1977, sexual abuse reports were very rare. They were less than 4% of all the reports that came to the system. And the two patrol officers said, yeah, she's in the back of the room there. It hurts her to talk about it, they said. You know, obviously this child's going through pain every time she has to describe it. And it didn't occur to me to say, so what did she tell you? So I don't have to go ask her. But I went back in there and sat her down and had her tell me again. And obviously this child was in great pain. It was like reliving the trauma. We now call that in trauma treatment a trauma narrative. Except for there was no preparation on her part. There was no support for her. She was asked to just provide a raw narrative of what happened to the patrol officers and now to me. And when I got ready to leave, having got my needs met to do my job, I encountered two detectives. They were headed in to talk to her again. And we talked about how upset she was and how hard it was to talk about. And I didn't tell them, here's what she said, you don't need to talk to her. They went in and had her go through it again. And then the patrol officers were hanging around waiting because they were waiting for the detective to finish so they could take her down to the med, which is the big hospital in Memphis, where she'd wait for hours before someone would put her on her gurney, close the curtain, and have her talk again. And she didn't say it that day, but it was in the back of my mind. It's like, why aren't you big people talking to one another? There was something wrong. No matter how much I cared about my job, how much I knew, I was just one part of the system. And that began really to occur to a number of people around the country in the 1980s when child sexual abuse began to explode. Before 1984 and 1985, sexual abuse was a rare event. Then one day there was a TV movie called Something About Amelia. Some nodding heads. Ted Danson played the father in the household. Ted Danson is this attractive guy that was the star of Cheers, was the heartthrob of America, and he played a child molesting father. And Glenn Close played his wife, and a little girl named Roxana Zell played Amelia. It was just a TV movie on ABC, except for it changed the world. There was something remarkable about the fact that Ted Danson would be a child molester that would look that way and still molest kids, that it became okay the next day for people to start talking about sexual abuse. And within the space of about a year, the society changed. And sexual abuse became very commonly discussed and very commonly reported. And for the first time, children were marching into courtrooms and having to testify about sexual abuse by members of their family, which virtually had not happened up in that point, other than the most rarest cases. And this notion that the system was ill-equipped to deal with these highly traumatized kids began to emerge. We didn't call it trauma-informed systems then, but the notion that we can do better. You heard that at one point I was director of something called the National Children's Advocacy Center. It's a program in Huntsville, Alabama. Huntsville, Alabama, I know people in California have stereotypical images of Alabama. People in Ohio might as well. Huntsville happens to be one of those, a real interesting place because it's where NASA is. So it's this really high-tech town. And a grandmother stormed in the DA's office one day, and the DA, to his credit, listened. She said, you know, you guys are supposed to be helping my granddaughter, but you're making it worse. You're just not working together. And the DA's credit, he listened, and then he took a group of community leaders and they went through they walked through that child's journey. And she had told her grandmother that she had been molested by her dad. And the grandmother got her daughter and said, we need to go get help for this child. And they went down to the Child Protection Agency. And I'm doing something wrong? No, I'm being swapped. Do we have another speaker coming in there? Well, I get to say this microphone. Am I on? Oh. I'm on. Am I too on? Okay. All right, in the back of the room now, do you hear me? Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear? Someone in the back of the room, raise your hand if you hear my voice. Okay. Because I can hear my voice echoing here. It's a little freaky, but. So this grandmother stormed the DA's office and said, you're making it worse. And so that district attorney took the community leaders on a journey. Got the mayor, got the head of the junior league, community groups, political officials, head of child welfare, said, let's travel where this child traveled. And they walked in the front door of the child welfare agency, and behind, here's this little scared kid who told her grandmother the scariest thing that ever happened to her. and was told not to tell, and she told her anyway. So she's scared, she's traumatized. She walks in the front door of the Child Welfare Agency, and what does she see? She sees a lady behind a glass booth in her armed guard, because that's where they gave out food stamps. And the grandmother walks up and talks to this brisk lady behind the booth who's busy trying to check in folks for AFDC appointments and food stamps, and says, go upstairs, see the one in the social worker. So they get on the elevator, they go up the elevator, down the hall, into this room with open office, landscaping cubicles, and explain to the person they encounter what they're there for, and they say, well, sit down over there and talk to the social worker, she's here. And so this little girl sits down in the cubicle and is asked about the scariest thing that ever happened to her. And to her credit, she tells them. So they go, okay, this is serious stuff. All right, you need to talk to the police. So they make a phone call and they tell the detective, we're going to send this family down to talk to you now. So they get back in the car and they drive to the Huntsville Police Department. They walk into the police department, down the hall where guys in orange jumpsuits are walking by with shackles, down to the detective's office where they're sitting there in big wooden desks and in an open bay, and sit her down on a hard wooden chair and ask to talk about the scariest thing that ever happened to her. And she tells them. They then think, okay, we need her examined medically. So they put her in the car, they take her to the emergency department at the Madison County Hospital, where she waits for a couple hours before they put her on a gurney, close the curtain, and some doctor said, so what happened, kid? And she has to do it again, and now she's examined. And then this family thought, this has been a very traumatizing experience for the child. She needs help. So they went to the mental health center, where they put her in a wait room with adult mental health, chronically mentally ill patients, before she went down the hall and saw a therapist who didn't specialize in kids, and certainly didn't have, the concept of evidence-based practice in 1983 was beyond its infancy. Some were preconception about it. And Lord knows what treatment she got. And they thought, right, this lady was right. It's not that the cops didn't do their job. It's not the social worker didn't do their job, or the doctor didn't do their job, or the mental health person. It's when we put it all together, we actually created a hodgepodge, and the hodgepodge was making it worse. So to their credit, they set out and they began talking to other places, and they found a few places, San Diego being one, LA being one, Seattle, just Chicago, well, places that were actually beginning to come together and say, we can do this better, and have a team approach to child abuse. Now that's before anybody started using trauma-informed systems, but in fact, we created the beginning of a trauma-informed system that day by bringing those systems together. Now I came down to direct this agency, which opened the Little House. They created the first child advocacy center, where when you walked in the front door, instead of seeing the lady behind the glass booth, you saw Brutus the fish, which was in a big fish tank. So Brutus kept dying, so eventually we had Brutus the ghost fish. And you saw, children's stuff on the wall. This was a child's place. And a colleague of ours, Ben knows her, Connie Carnes, was the clinical director at the time, and Connie called up one day and said, I got an unusual request. I said, what's that? We have a child who came here to be interviewed, and she's been coming back for therapy. She'd like to have her birthday party here. It was the safest place in the world. We had created a safe place. Now, she had other safe places, but this place felt safe. And so we had the beginnings of this thing called trauma-informed systems. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today, is jumping forward now 20 years. What are we doing about trauma-informed systems? How do we begin to do that? And what we find when we begin to really think about how systems can be turned into trauma-informed systems is a lot of good child welfare practice and good mental health practice and good substance abuse practice and good juvenile justice practice all are consistent with trauma-informed practices. I was meeting with a group of about 20 Cleveland staff today from child welfare. And some of the practices people say, well, we do this in Cleveland, is really as good as you can do. I mean, you're doing some really good stuff. It's how do you standardize that? How do you get that every day? And how do you build on those notions that what good practice is becomes trauma-informed practice? There is this thing you heard referenced in called the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that Congress funded back in 2001. It really brings a number of trauma programs together to really kind of think through how do we best treat these children and families. And in an early meeting of that group, our colleague of ours, Tony Manarino, was trying to conduct a meeting around child sexual abuse treatment and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And he was really having a hard time getting the conversation focused on clinical issues because people kept raising their hands and said, what do you do if the child changes foster care placement? What do you do if the child has to go back to court? All these system issues got in the way. And we began to recognize we really need to look at the systems. And so the definition we're currently working on in our program for what's called a trauma-informed system is it's a child welfare system. You can change that, insert words mental health system, juvenile justice system. But it's a system in which all the parties involved recognize and respond to the varying impacts of traumatic stress. The key word is on varying impact. Once you start talking about trauma, it doesn't mean all kids experience trauma, experience it the same way, have the same symptoms. Not everybody who's had horrible stuff needs to go to trauma treatment. It's looking how the varying response, which is based on a whole number of variables, which other speakers probably have talked about today, everything from their genetics to their life experiences to their caregivers. But how we respond to those varying experiences of the child, which is where we started talking about this 5 or 6 years ago, and then realized, or their caregivers. It's not just the children who are traumatized. Often the families we're dealing with in child protection, mental health, substance abuse, juvenile justice, are just big trauma victims. Trauma in their own childhood, trauma last week. And those who work and have contact with this, in effect the workforce. A trauma-informed system recognizes the only people to be traumatized are not just the child and their caregivers and their families, but often the workforce, you guys. And that's what Charles Figley was talking about earlier this week. It's the vicarious trauma, the secondary trauma exposures, how all those systems interplay. Programs and organizations within the system will infuse that knowledge, awareness, and skills into the organization cultures, policies, and practices. It's not just good enough that we have training or that we have a policy that says something. How do you actually infuse that into the culture where it's just the way we do business? We become more trauma aware, more trauma sensitive, and we're driving the system forward. And then act in collaboration, using the best science available to facilitate and support resilience and recovery. It's integrating the system because one organization, one therapist, one caseworker, one probation officer can't do it alone. We've got to align with these elements of the system and move forward. So that's what we've been actually trying to figure out for a couple years now. And there's some simple concepts buried into what something that's hard to do, but conceptually, it's not so you can't get your mind around it. It's just hard to do it day to day. So the couple of simple frames are, one is we begin to look at things through a trauma lens. How many people here are child welfare? Here's your 50 people that you were looking to see whether we had 50 people here today. How many people are juvenile justice type of people? Domestic violence, mental health, substance abuse and mental health put together, Adams Board type. Law enforcement. So it's courts. So all you are coming in and interacting with these kids. One simple notion of trauma-informed system is you're dealing with people with trauma histories, but if you begin to look at them through a trauma lens, if I think about trauma, if I think about how human beings respond to trauma, would I behave differently? I look back at my days in child protection. I probably, as I told the group this morning, probably thinking of the kids I made the decision I needed to remove from home, I probably made the right decisions. Even with all the new science and knowledge and research that's come along, I'm pretty sure I made pretty good judgments about who was safe to stay and who was not. But the way those kids were removed, the way I removed them from the home, in retrospect, was horrible, because I was focused on getting them physically safe. Had I looked at it through a trauma lens and thought, how do I make this less painful for the child, less traumatizing, I might have behaved differently. And how do we then weave this notion of trauma-informed, into the very fabric of what we do? For child welfare, the very fabric is built around federal requirements of safety and risk and permanency and well-being. And we've already been weaving in things like being developmentally informed about developmental practices and developmental levels of kids and how well they're doing, about cultural, dealing with different cultures, about this concept of using the best evidence. So we're talking now about adding another weave, another thread, about using the best trauma-informed perspective in order to try and achieve better outcomes for children and families. So what is a trauma-informed system? Now, a trauma-informed system first starts with understanding the impact of childhood traumatic stress and adult stress on the people served by the system. Understanding that by itself is not enough. You need to understand how the system itself can mitigate the problem or actually make it worse. That unintended consequence, you're supposed to be helping my granddaughter, but you're making it worse. Now, this is a dizzying looking slide. It's not made just to overwhelm you, it's just necessarily that so. If you take a child, and that child is surrounded by their family, by their life context, what's happened up to this moment, by their community, by their cultural context in which they view the world, and along comes a traumatic event. All these issues will shape how that child will respond. The basic intrinsic issues within the child, their family, their culture, their past experience. But then along we come. All this stuff over here is us. We have child protection and child protective attorneys and guardians of lines in juvenile court up here. We have firefighters and EMTs, medical personnel. You have law enforcement, district attorneys, victim witness people, criminal court. You have mental health. You have new schools and substitute care providers, families. All these folks have the ability to help or hurt. And how that child experiences what comes next is influenced by how those systems align. And when they align well, they can make a real difference. When they don't align well, they can have a horrible outcome. They can add to the stress. And it's not always the systems you think. You can have the most caring, committed child protection worker, but if the child's experience in school is very negative to the event, it's still going to ripple through. Even the faith community. There's a colleague that's well known in our field, Anna Salter, who had a child who came to her, who at the time she was working, I think, in Vermont. And the child had been molested by another member of her church where she was very involved. And the church was very important to this child. So the child went to church, and the guy who molested her came to church one day, and he was on bail. And he stood up before the congregation and confessed, "I have sinned. Will you forgive me?" And the minister said to the congregation, will we forgive Brother Jones? And they said, "Yes, we will. It's God's position to judge." And then the minister turned to the little girl in the back of the room and said, "Will you forgive Brother Jones?" And everybody's head turned to her, and she wasn't ready for that. She didn't go back to church the next week. What became a source of support became a source of pain. So the whole system issues, how we get all these people aligned, moving in the same direction, becomes really critical. Even if you take one single box up here, child protection. Child protection and child welfare exist as a sequential model. I talked to people in the sexual abuse unit today and in the intake units. There are foster care. I mean, the child experience isn't defined by a single caseworker. I was an intake worker. I would make initial investigation. I would form an initial relationship with the child, figure out what happened. And then if I remove the child, they go to somebody else. And so how do you take this and shift, not just how do you make this person trauma-informed, but how do you make the transition to that worker or this worker, or when this person takes another job and the new worker gets assigned, how do we build the system where there's a sense of trauma connection to the information's passed from person to person to person, element to element? How do you give the training and skills they need? And then when you throw in people like foster parents, how do you get information past the foster parent? How do you train the foster parent? There's something called the Resource Parent Training Curriculum that we've developed in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that is being used around the country. How do you equip the foster parents to understand trauma and be able to manage it? All become key elements of kind of thinking through. Because as Tom Morton, who was director in Clark County, in Nevada, which is Las Vegas, who's part of our advisory committee, said, you're not handing off a person, or you're handing off a person, you're not handing off a case record. So many times people in the system think, I'm just moving this record to the next person, but you're actually moving that person. So how do you do that? So a trauma-informed system knows about trauma. It also knows about how the system impacts on it and how to promote factors of resiliency and begin to understand the potential impact of current and past trauma on family members. We often deal with families that make us angry. I mean, they've done things to hurt kids. They're not in the best of place. We're not seeing them in the best of life. And it's so easy just to not like that person, to want to view that person as the problem. But they themselves may just be a constellation of past traumas. And how do we begin to approach them in ways that if there is hope inside that person, if there's potential, how do we get to that, past that crust of anger, resistance, and threatening behavior at times. And so what we may be doing is just serving to help trigger their memories of past traumas, and how do we get beyond that so they begin to help, or so they can begin to engage in a process. Because their traumas may be interfering with their ability to protect and care for their child. And then, as we said, the trauma-informed system looks at the vicarious impact of trauma on the workforce and recognizes that if you do this work long enough, you yourself get exposed to trauma. You're working in scary neighborhoods. You see things that other people don't have to see. You may yourself become a victim of an assault, or you certainly will have to worry about it. So we began within the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. We said, so how do you really turn that into a meaningful trauma system? What are practical steps you can take? So we identified originally 8, and now we're up to, I think, 11 essential elements of trauma-informed practice. The first one is probably the most universally useful one to concept to get in your head. And it's simple. You just have to think about it this way. For many of our systems, particularly in the child welfare system, we have focused for most of the experience in achieving physical safety. It's a big deal if you get a report of child abuse and you don't figure out what happened and the child's re-abused. That's what gets you on the front page of the paper. So physical safety is a big deal. And not to minimize the importance for physical safety, but in a trauma-informed system, it's not enough. You have to go further than that. You have to think, how do we create a sense of safety, this concept of psychological safety? Because if we're going to help the child recover from the past traumas, how do we make them where they feel safe in addition to being safe? And then we begin to teach people the concepts of triggers. What are the things that are triggering their reactions? I have a friend who was sexually assaulted when she was a young girl. She was dragged into a crawl space underneath the house. And during the sexual assault, she stared at the spider web that was weaving above her head. 40 years later, 50 years later, she sees a spider. Her body's still reacting to the stimuli that spider represents. She long ago lost the connection. It took her a while to figure out, oh yeah, that's maybe where I wasn't afraid of spiders before that period. There are things that trigger kids' reactions, and their reactions often, in adults, their reactions are actually occurring at a level that they don't even think about. So we begin to explore in a trauma-informed system, how does the concept of achieving psychological safety and recognizing what triggers kids in ways that we can try and avoid those so we can achieve that safety. So we see this concept of maximizing the sense of safety applied in different ways in different parts of the experience. For child welfare, it's everything from how children are removed from the homes. How do we make them feel as safe as possible? How do we provide some sense of security in what otherwise is a very frightening thing? So you find caseworkers spending time talking to kids about where they're going. In some places they have out a little photo thing. Here's the house this is Mrs. Jones' house, you're gonna sleep there tonight. Here's Mrs. Jones. Here's her dog. Here's the picture here. It's kind of diffusing that. It's what will help you, what will help you sleep better at that house tonight? Is there anything you want to take from your room? Just taking the time to give the child some choices in an environment in which they have no choices helps begin to diffuse that. But then we discovered, that type of good practice is good, but if you're not in a trauma-informed system, it can be undone. In Orange County, California, the workers started doing that because that's what they were trained to do. And they would take the children to Orangewood, which was a shelter facility. Orangewood had a policy. Because of headlights, we don't want any objects brought in here that didn't start here. So they immediately take all that stuff away from the kid and give them new clothes and new stuff. But that was their transitional security object, and it's now gone. So how do you kind of ensure the system is playing to do that? In Florida, we're doing some work in Florida, they actually send a mental health therapist into the home the night that they're doing the removal, or the day they're doing the removal, to help focus on the child. And begin to try and do that. How do you also then utilize the information gathered throughout this whole process to do a really good assessment of what the child's trauma experiences are and how it's impacting on their development and behavior? and then to guide services when it's appropriate. We've seen some folks who kind of get into trauma-informed systems and then think, well, everybody needs TFCBT. TFCBT is really good stuff, but everybody doesn't need it. And it's not the right fit for everybody. So how do we guide services? And for kids who have trauma exposure and trauma symptoms, how do we help them reduce the overwhelming emotion? A lot of times we're seeing kids who just are just full of anger and energy or confusion, and it's playing out in their behavior, and there's subtle changes in their behavior, their development, their relationships. And how do we help them kind of manage through that? And I encountered a little kid in the hallway the other day, and he was like a poster child for a cute kid. And actually I was touring some people who were doing a little fundraiser for us around the building, so they were in the conference room, and I got ready to take them down to show them another part of our center, and looked out in the hall, and this little kid was staying in the hall, and he was scared about it. It was his first visit, and he was just refusing to go in the therapy room. And so I said, hang on here a little minute, got to give this kid a little space, because I didn't want to bring 20 people down the hall right in the middle of this when the therapist is trying to get the child moved into the room. And the corner of my eye, I watched this little cute kid turn into the tiny tot from hell. How does trauma play out in their lives in such a way as they transform kids into tiny tots from hell? And how do we transform them back? And how do we help, as they come back, make new meaning out of the trauma history? And to do that, introduces this notion that you've heard about of evidence-based practice. What's the right evidence-based practice for this child? Just because it's evidence-based doesn't mean it's right for every child. So how do you figure out which is the right practice at which time and who's able to do it? Those become key issues, particularly for people making referrals and making judgments. So there's a concept that emerges here in this kind of trauma-informed notion of it includes assessment, is really bringing the distinction between several terms that get thrown around a lot. For people who are child welfare workers or probation officers or DV shelters, people who are working with these families who are not providing mental health treatment or not licensed mental health professionals, there's a role, and we call it screening. That's distinguished from assessment, which is more of a mental health function to do actual assessment or psychological evaluations, which is clearly mental health. But screening can be done by frontline workers. We do screening every day, even if we don't call it. We make decisions to refer kids or not refer kids. This kid needs help, this kid doesn't. So one thing in a trauma-informed system people are going to do is create tools to help guide that screening and training. So they can look at, based on this child's unique characteristics, who do we need to see services with? In Cleveland, you've got some top-notch trauma therapists. But not every therapist in Cleveland is a top-notch trauma therapist. So if you have limited resources, who do we send to the trauma specialist and who don't we? That's part of a screening process. And so what we do in trauma screening is there are a brief set of questions. We actually don't encourage child welfare workers or probation officers or DV shelter folks to sit down and interview children about their trauma histories. But based on information you know from the investigation, from the case record, from caregivers, what do we know about this child's trauma history? We may find that we know they came into care for neglect or for physical abuse, but the biggest trauma in the child's life may not be that at all. It may be the sexual abuse that happened at the hands of Uncle Billy. It may be not the sexual abuse that happened to Uncle Billy. It may be the night the SWAT team kicked in the door and people came in with goggles and masks and weapons. And so what's the trauma history that influences this and helps the child, we wanted to screen to help the child determine if they need trauma-focused mental health treatment, and then how to integrate that knowledge. So there's some examples, there's some in your, I think you guys have my PowerPoint slides. So at the end there are some website addresses for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. You can download what's called the Child Welfare Training Toolkit, and you'll get a copy of one of the screening tools right there for free. But the types of things you're screening for and making those broad judgments is based on, sometimes it's on the experience. If the child's been shot or sexually penetrated or stabbed, some sort of intrusive injury, it's probably a child that probably should get a good trauma assessment. You shouldn't probably rule that one out, even if they're asymptomatic right now. You might want to get them assessed based on the severity of the history alone. But if they report, or the caregivers report, re-experiencing trauma events, things like nightmares, flashbacks, repetitive play, reacting strongly to reminders of trauma, and you can see that playing out, that's a child who would benefit from a good trauma assessment. This notion of triggers or reminders plays out over and over again. In Devereaux, which is an agency in Florida, they actually now have little cards. They figure out what triggers the kids, and they issue a set of cards to all the caregivers, because they're a shift-based residential treatment here. And they walk around with these things on their book and say, all right, I got to get Susie back in the room. She's not wanting to go. Let me glance down here. All right, grabbing her shoulder is a bad thing. Okay, not to grab Susie on the shoulder. And begin to record those kind of trauma history pieces. So if we see things that are reminders, the foster parent who, Mr. Jones, the foster parent, had been a good, he and his wife had been fostering 25, 30 kids. They've done great. They have very structured processes. One thing that goes on in the foster home, in the Jones foster home. They sit down for dinner every night at 6 o'clock. TV's off. We sit, have dinner together. It's a family ritual. New foster child won't come to the table. They won't come to the table, and Mr. Jones gets angry. He insists the child come to the table. The child won't come to the table. He's telling the caseworker, this child doesn't come to the table. You got to find another place, because our family rules the child comes to the table. Caseworker knows the trauma history and explains his mother was stabbed to death in front of him at the table. The table is a scary place. It's a very unsafe place. Understanding the things that trigger kids helps define whether they need a good trauma assessment. When kids are actively avoiding things that will remind them of trauma, is another kind of hint that this kid needs a good assessment. Then you need to find in your community, I think you happen to have that in Cleveland, you're lucky, lots of places don't, mental health professionals who can do real good trauma assessment. So for our point of view, a good trauma assessment really drives treatment planning. Every kid doesn't get the same flavor. The treatment plan is based on the child's unique needs. Good trauma assessment to us includes several sessions. It's not all done in one. It's a good clinical interview, but it's also use of objective measures. We collect data on kids at our center, as you do in some centers here in Cleveland, that help drive the clinical decision making and assess how progress is going. And we cover everything from basic demographics to evaluation of the child's problems. Good trauma assessment then drives the treatment selection. Based on this, you can then select the right evidence-based practice for the right child. And it fits, because it's designed to uniquely fit that child. But a trauma-informed system also coordinates services with other agencies, because it has to be a system. Mental health practitioner working alone can't succeed. Child welfare can't succeed. Only by working together. So the challenge is in a trauma-informed system for each of us to reach out to work with the others. And then to work with the family to promote stable and permanent relations. These kids don't get better by themselves. They get better in the context of their caregiving relationships. So how can we provide guidance to support those stable relationships? So Mr. Jones doesn't tell the child he has to leave. He figures out how to make the child feel safe at the dinner table instead. So that foster home can become a source of support and progress rather than another failure, another rejection. How do we help the birth parents make that transition to be able to do that? And because we recognize that lots of those caregivers that we interact are trauma victims as well. There's a woman we've gotten to know in San Diego. Her name is Pam Toohey. And I'd heard she was a good speaker. We've worked with her on some committees. And I didn't realize that her journey had come through the Chadwick Center. And she tells a story of a family. And she shows pictures of this young woman doing cocaine. A photo snapshot taken years ago. And then she shows the same young woman with a baby when she got hooked on meth. And then we show this horrible series of images of this very frail, thin, cavity-ridden, meth addict and her children. And then she tells the story of the day CPS came and found that this 4-year-old child was dramatically underweight and came into the system. And then the experience of this young woman through foster care. And as it actually goes through time, and she starts getting better and starts getting help and finds a mental health substance agency that really can kind of connect with her. And then you begin to realize the face is changing. And the young woman she's talking about is her. And this middle class, articulate professional person you're talking to was this person you would have crossed the street to avoid. And then her child gets molested. And she goes back. But then she finds, I didn't realize it until she was telling the story. I felt really proud when she said, and then we went to the Chadwick Center and had a good outcome. Because I got scared when she said, we went to the Chadwick Center. I go, oh God. Hope we didn't screw things up. But she found strength there and moved on, and now she is out helping other parents. But her life story is one trauma after the next. So how do we reach to these families, not for the person that's before us, but for the person inside that can be brought out? If we play our cards right, if we reach to them as trauma victims and connect with them, so they can in turn, as Pam has done, become the advocate for their own children and be able to care for their own children and manage their future. Then how do we manage our stress? What Charles Figley talked about. All those key pin elements play into what makes a trauma-informed system. Now, when it comes together, you have to kind of figure out how do you weave that in, how do you put it in. So we've started looking at, there's the graph, it's a magnifying glass, another trauma lens here. Looking at child welfare, how we can weave that into the casework practice model that's used by child welfare agencies across the country. And so how you would do that from the investigation is different than how you would do it at adoption. And so at each step along the way, from initial assessment, in-home services, out-of-home services, the case planning, the case management, the permanency planning, whether they stay with the parents, they go to adoption, they go to guardianship, independent living. How do you do that? We've been spending time talking to I call them kids because I'm my age, but young adults who've been through foster care and asking them a lot, what would have made it different? Sometimes they talk about how the things that well-meaning people did that made it worse for them. You know, the child who came in the new foster home scared, went to the church with the foster parent, and the well-meaning foster parent did the nice thing they thought, and the church did the nice thing, which is, I'd like to introduce my new foster child. And the whole church says, welcome. But the last thing that child says I wanted to be done is have a spotlight turned on me that day. And so well-meaning stuff sometimes can backfire. So how do we create trauma-informed systems at each step of the way? And you could take this same concept and apply it to mental health, to substance abuse, domestic violence, to all the systems in the room. And begin to think, if you're coming through the system, how do you shift that? Our group in Florida, I was working with them one afternoon, and they were birth parents, part of the group. And we're talking about TFCBT and the therapists, and the therapists are getting trained. And this mom makes this observation that, you know, I actually have a therapist I feel good with, and if you're talking about teaching this new thing that will help my child, that's great. But to get to them, I have to get by the front desk. And I'm afraid of the front desk. And the front desk agent, the receptionist at that agency, she perceived as this threatening person who disapproved of her being late, a few minutes late because she got stuck coming in traffic, who chastised her, who did all these things. And so a trauma-informed system begins to think, how do you actually align all the resources, the whole experience together? So it begins to treat people with the respect and understanding that they need, and recognizing that they themselves may be victims of trauma. And to begin to shift, you actually have to shift at all levels. If you want the caseworkers, the police officers, the therapists, the medical people to behave differently, you have to worry about their knowledge, their skills, their ability, and their training. But that's not enough, because they exist within what the Institute of Healthcare Improvement came up with this particular model out of Boston, called the microsystem. But that's the units. Yeah. How do you get the supervisors, the coworkers to buy into the same issue? It's how you begin to shift culture, and how you get the organization itself to wrap the policies, procedures, the resources in such a way to support the actions you want to occur here at the front line. And then ultimately the community, from the political leaders to the regulatory agencies, to the public itself. Can we align all those folks to produce the change we want here at the tip where we interact with families? All those pieces get played into. So making the concept of trauma-informed system is actually pretty simple, but doing it is really tough. And how you get all that stuff aligned. Because the systems are full of human beings, and with all their variations. It's a little bit like herding cats, and they're just running everywhere. How do you get them There's a line from a book called Corporate Culture. It was a big management book in the 80s, or the 90s. But it was, the job of the CEO, or in this case, people who want to shift change, is get the herd moving roughly westward. The notion isn't you're going to get everybody to doing the same thing, but how can you get everybody moving roughly in the direction of a more trauma-informed system? Because when you can line it all up together, you can really kind of make a difference. Now, this is a bit of a stretch, but it's a damn cute stretch, so hang with me. If you get trauma resources, trauma systems, trauma therapists, all working in the same direction, we can take and give kids the tools necessary that they don't have to be controlled by the horrible stuff that happened to them. This is a child of a 9/11 victim who'd been through good treatment. It isn't going to change what happened, but in therapy, in support, in good resiliency, we're giving the children the tools that will allow them to be able to manage their anxiety, to deal with those triggers and stress, and be able to do that. And I suddenly realize I have to go here and do this.
Well, whenever someone's feeling embarrassed or nervous or sad, I know exactly how to fix it. You and I must make a path. You will say salvation back. Where there is love, I'll be there. Now close your eyes. Are you thinking bad things, or are you thinking lovely and good things?
Kids don't have to be controlled for it. We can give them the tools that they can control it themselves. These are some resources that are useful. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the Chadwick Center. This is Ben Saunders' site, the TFCBT online program. This is actually the old address, I just realized. The California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse is a resource that looks at the science behind practices used in child welfare. We now have over 200 programs we reviewed. It's designed to be used by non-researchers. This address I think will still work, but the current address is actually shorter. It's CBC, which is California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse. CBC, the number 4 CW, or just Google Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. It's probably the most commonly used evidence-based clearinghouse in the world for child welfare-related and child abuse stuff. But there's all sorts of information there about what works and those things that we don't have any evidence yet. So I hope as you struggle in Cleveland to bring an enormous body of talented people together effectively, we can do so with a trauma lens, use the best assessment to drive the best practice, to provide the best support, and kids will be like this kid, and they will be able to control their future. So thank you very much.